The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on demonstrating leadership across your roles. This is part of the Boost Your Career webinars that are co-sponsored by Sue Mentors and Tulane University. Today's format is a little different. We're having a case study. You'll be hearing from me, Sue Griffey, with the overall topic, and then you'll hear from Dr. Lee Ann Braun, who will actually discuss her experiences with demonstrating leadership. Let's start with leadership. This is a common issue for people moving into 10 to 15 years of work who are getting more senior in their career and needing to demonstrate the leadership that they've been doing. It usually happens in your career path that you start with doing some kind of technical work. Then you may manage and lead a group of the same kinds of technical experts, and then get to higher level leading that may be even at the organizational level and above. So I wanted to go back to the level 5 leadership concept that Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, a very famous book that's worth reading, and his 5 levels of leadership. I really think leadership begins at level 3, as we'll see in the next slide. Here's a different view of the 5 levels from Jim Collins. And what he calls level 3, the competent manager, to me is where the competent leader starts to begin. People that are at this level are beginning to have budgetary access and control. They have a team of people and manage them and lead them to a productivity of some kind, and often have a seat at the table, at least with the next level of leadership above them. And so I've put in red on the left that I think this begins competent leader, and then you move on up. To go back to framing this a little bit, level 3 begins to change you into a leader. And part of what happens in taking on the role of a leader is what we call role realignment. And as you can see from the thumbnail in the bottom left, we've covered this also in a previous webinar in a little more detail than today. But basically, the definition of this is the change that you need to make to function in your new role. So what you're doing is really adopting and living the new behaviors of what you're hired to do. Mental image, increased confidence, not just applying maybe new skills you've learned or new ways of managing. So let's think about how and in what way it comes to be that you're doing some leadership maybe at level 3, but you aren't necessarily describing how you are leading. And this comes with role realignment, moving into becoming a competent leader. On the left, 2 mismatched socks. Well, you could also look at them as 2 different kinds of socks. So maybe this is where you have aspects of leadership in different jobs. You've done some of this sporadically, but either you don't do it routinely or you don't acknowledge it, a situation where you're not necessarily matched up to what you're doing. On the right, again, I know I chose a dramatic photo. Maybe you're doing this role, but you're not really telling that you did it. And we'll be going into more detail on this. Here are the kinds of situations where you need to describe this leadership, and it seems to come front and center when you're looking at getting a new job or a promotion, if you're moving into a new or a different technical area, or if you're moving to a new location and also trying to get a job. Sometimes it even comes when opportunities in an area that you live in are limited and you're trying to move into a job either in a new location or in the same location. Mentees that I've worked with where this is happening to them almost uniformly tell me they've already started reaching out to friends and colleagues immediately. The problem is that people that are 10 to 15 years into their career, and oftentimes in a job where they've been 2 to 3 years at least, don't necessarily keep their professional presence up to date. And maybe networking has also fallen by the wayside. So they're not necessarily, they haven't been necessarily keeping an eye on what's been happening in the external environment, other potential opportunities. So I'd like to talk about what the basis of your leadership presence needs to be. And that is these 4 activities, which we'll go through briefly, and then you'll see more detail and specific examples when Lee Ann describes how she worked through this. First, you need to tell your story. It's very easy for people 10 to 15 years in their career to portray what they've done technically. So they often will talk about technical accomplishments and say, well, here it is. This is how I've done it. But they're not describing what they've done in leadership. So you need to weave a story for people. You also need to make sure that each job you've had, especially where you've had leadership opportunities and experience, you need to make sure that those descriptions of those jobs describe the leading, not the technical work you've done. And if this was as simple as following the Google search and looking at these 7 phrases for leadership skills, it's not just tailoring your resume. You have other webinars you can look at about tailoring your resume, but the key is you need to know what kinds of positions are you looking at, but also what is the language that you should be talking to effectively convey how you're a leader. The third area is increasing your leadership visibility. LinkedIn gives you a great opportunity. It gives you now the opportunity to put in a headline. And for me, they've actually suggested I use the most recent mentoring program that I've joined. I will not be changing that, but you can see that you can choose a headline that will help you increase your visibility. And Lee Ann's going to go into even more detail on LinkedIn soon. Also, you need to restart your networking. And again, we have a webinar for that. So think about increasing your visibility as twofold. And the last is making sure you use an outside perspective for feedback. This isn't just the mentoring coach that you can work with, the left-hand image, on your professional presence to make sure that your written documents, your LinkedIn profile are up to date. You actually need to practice this for an interview, for networking situations, to make sure that you're clearly conveying what you've done in leadership. So I'd like to introduce you now again to Dr. Lee Ann Braun, who's going to discuss her experiences, her before and after examples for each of the 4 steps I just went through. Lee Ann, it's all yours.
Sue. Okay, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to talk about my story. It's still unfolding, as all of our stories are. But I'm going to give a little background first on where I started out my career. So I landed in New Orleans 30 years ago, actually in 1989, to do a master's in public health, and then stayed on and did a PhD. And completed that in 1995. I stayed at Tulane as research faculty. I had, throughout my both my master's and my doctoral degrees, had increasingly focused on program evaluation, and stayed on and conducted and worked in the area of program evaluation internationally at Tulane. Until from 1995 until 2007, and during that time, it was, again, focused on program evaluation of family planning, reproductive health, and HIV/AIDS programs, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. I had been mostly in a technical role, although as time went on, increasingly took on responsibilities, including leading some teams and taking on some initial leadership roles. After Hurricane Katrina, so this was kind of both a personal and professional time change, I moved to the Louisiana Public Health Institute to take a position as the Director of Evaluation and Research. And while there were certainly a lot of technical aspects of that role, it really meant moving from from a solely technical focus to much more of a generalist focus. So I was no longer focused on one specific public health area in terms of program evaluation. But in addition, I was taking on much more of a leadership role within the organization. And I was in that role for 12 years until just this past summer. But about a year ago, my family was considering a big change, both in terms of location, but I knew that also meant a potential professional change. So I knew this was going to be a challenge, and so I really felt like I needed to start right away and take time to do that work. So as I just mentioned, I was now 20 plus years into my career. I was in a leadership role, and I knew that those kind of roles are harder to get. You know, they're not as plentiful as perhaps entry-level positions. And I knew it was going to take time to make that change, especially because I was also making a geographic change. So I anticipated some of the challenges that needed to be addressed, which is why I thought it was really critical to get an outside perspective. And I knew Sue already from our time at Tulane together, and I knew she was had started her Sue Mentors business, and so I immediately contacted her and said, I need help. I don't know how to articulate all of the work that I have been doing. You know, after, again, I've been on the job for many years, busy just doing the job, but had not stepped back to articulate particularly the leadership aspects of my position. And also I, you know, had been busy, as I said, busy working hard. And so while I had kept my CV updated chronologically in terms of the positions and publications, it was in a very old style, and it did not at all articulate my career focus at this stage in my life, and did not articulate my leadership accomplishments. So having a coach really helped me think through what my current skill set is, particularly around leadership, and how to articulate that in a narrative biographical paragraph format. So it took a while. It was challenging to figure out how best to articulate, and I had to think a lot about what I had actually been doing, is particularly from a leadership perspective. I had, up until that point, really not spent much time thinking about how to describe the leadership role I had been in for the past 12 years and how it had evolved over that time. Not only was I leading a technical team of evaluators, but I was also an active member of the LPHI leadership team and had contributed to several organizational changes related to organizational structure and human resource management. And in addition, I was spending a lot of time mentoring junior staff, as well as student interns, many of whom were from Tulane. And none of that experience was reflected in my CV. So I felt that it was really important to first update my professional presence and to redo my CV. So this took quite a bit of time, and it was challenging because it took me a while to figure out how to even describe what I had been doing, because I'd just been busy doing it. And so over time, it took a few months to rework my description of my role. And here you can see on the left box is how I was initially started describing it, which really still focused on my technical work and accomplishments, but really was still focused on leading evaluation work as opposed to leading at an organizational level. And you can see the box on the left, how I focused on my technical work and accomplishments and started really describing the leadership experience that was specific to my position and role. So I was a senior leader and manager who had directed programs, and also really adjusting the verb, that, making it more active as opposed to just, and making it more doing verbs as opposed to just more passive. So this next slide just shows how I went about reframing my leadership descriptions in my specific jobs. So specifically around my position at LPHI as the Director of Evaluation and Research. On the left, doesn't even mention leading at all, just talks about my specific responsibilities. Whereas once I reframed it on the right, I articulated specific examples of the leadership aspects of that role, right? So these two boxes are the same job, but focusing on very different aspects of the job, and the box on the right really focusing on the leadership components of that job. So leading one of 7 portfolios, leading being a member of the leadership team and around specific activities in that role, securing funding, leading staff professional development. So once I had I had articulated my accomplishments and my vision, and as a leader, I felt that at that point I was ready for the job search, and I really think it's incredibly important to do that preparation work before actually doing an active job search. I mean, it's always a good idea to see what's out there, but in terms of actually applying, I think it's really important to have those descriptions in place first. So once I had that language ready, I was able to, I was ready to put it on my LinkedIn profile, and to also redo my LinkedIn profile. I updated my picture, included all that new language. And then the other thing I did was subscribe to the LinkedIn Premium service, which you can, generally they'll give you at least 1 month for free. Sometimes you can find other opportunities for more than a month, but I found it worthwhile paying for the service for until I actually secured a position. And in my case, it was critical because it made me more visible to recruiters, which is ultimately how I got the position that I'm in now. So here is my revamped and updated electronic presence, primarily on LinkedIn. And you can see the language that came from the bio paragraph that we saw in the previous slide, that describes that I'm a senior leader and manager who's directed global and domestic health programs. I've led and managed staff, etc. So once I had my electronic presence ready, I felt ready to start reaching out to my network. And I really wanted to reactivate the international health network that I had built while I was working at Tulane in the late 90s and through 2007. And I had not really been in touch with many of those people since then. So that took some time. And I did that through email, through some personal phone calls, but also through LinkedIn. I reached out to a lot of people. The premium service also lets you, provides a certain number of free, what they call insight contacts, so you can message people that you couldn't otherwise do through the free service. And I was able to really reconnect with a lot of my former colleagues. The next thing that Sue referenced that's really important is writing and blogging. And it was a challenge to do that because it took time and took me to really reflect on what I had learned from specific projects. In this case, I wrote a blog about a health impact assessment that I had led at LPHI, but specifically how we had engaged the community affected by a proposed power plant as part of the health impact assessment, and how that community kept the project and the issue alive within the city government in New Orleans to this day, and how that work really galvanized their activism around this issue. Another important point about doing this kind of blogging is that those articles stay on your profile and they don't get lost in the feed. So if you just post something, it'll appear in your feed, but then it gets very quickly moved down the feed. Whereas if you post something on your page, then it stays there and for people to see much more easily. So once I had redone my CV, redone my electronic presence, started networking, started job searching, writing, I felt much more confident in actively looking for jobs. My family had already made the decision that we were moving to Denver, Colorado, and we're actively in the process of moving while I was doing the job search. I literally was interviewing while we were on the road, and ended up making a side trip to do an in-person interview for the position that I ultimately secured with Apt Associates. As I mentioned earlier, that job was initially found its way to me through a recruiter. So I was contacted by a recruiter about a position in Apt, and then I followed up, and there were several interviews. It was a a process that took a few months. So another really important challenge is around this. It takes time. It takes time not only to prepare yourself, but also the actual job search process takes time, particularly at a leadership level. But ultimately, I have now been in the job for almost 2 months, and been in Denver for about the same amount of time. I'm still, getting oriented to the position and learning about the company and how I can best fit in to and contribute from a leadership perspective. I will. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to Sue.
Thank you, Lee Ann. That was really made my my lead-in come to life, because you've lived it and been doing it. So it makes a great segue into our summary. As much as you can, keep your professional presence updated, but especially as you move into leadership, it's critical to make sure that you're telling a story that's effectively conveying your leading. Build your or rebuild your professional presence, because as you heard Lee Ann say, it's critical for a job search situation. You don't want people to see a LinkedIn profile with no picture, with not much description of anything, and you certainly won't be found by recruiters and hiring managers. Most important, I think, is you always need to lead with your leading and not your technical story. And that's a learned habit that you're going to make as a leader. And finally, using an external perspective, a coach, a mentor, a colleague can help you make sure you're effectively describing your leadership, but also help you practice using it so it becomes much more natural to you to use. There are a couple resources I feel had a pretty good discussion of how you express leadership on your resume, and you'll see these here that you might want to follow up more in addition to the other webinars I've mentioned. So thank you very much for attending today. As always, don't forget to check out our channel for many other Boost Your Career webinars and other professional development webinars from Tulane Alumni Career Services. And please contact Sarah or me, Sue, for more information on this topic or any ideas you have about another webinar you'd like.